office in its mission to provide the most accurate, timely, and accountable information possible to Congress, a critical role for us to function in our governing responsibility and stewardship of taxpayer dollars. The committee will consider this morning several bills. H.R. 9716, Increasing Baseline Updates Act, that's Rep. Moore and Swazi. H.R. 9751, the Executive Action Cost Transparency Act, led by the Pride of Kansas, Representative Estes. H.R. 9714, the CBO Oversight Act, led by Representatives Norman, McLean, and our newest member, Greg Lopez. H.R. 9711, the Congressional Budget Office Scheduling Reform Act, led by Representative Valadeo. H.R. 8068, the Stop the Baseline Bloat Act, led by none other than Mr. Grothman of Wisconsin and Mr. Case. H.R. 9686, the Health Panel Act, led by Representatives Carter and Burgess, and all of those considered in that order. Before I begin, I'd like to outline the structure of today's markup. Without objection, the ranking member, Mr. Boyle, and I have agreed that each of us will get 5 minutes to open this up. The debate time for each bill will be 10 minutes, evenly divided. The proponents of each bill will have 1 minute to close. The amendments considered by the committee will be those submitted pursuant to the agreement I made with ranking member Mr. Boyle. Of course, when we had that agreement, I don't think Notre Dame had lost, so I don't know if that's changed anything, but if it had, you can submit that for the record in writing. To ensure we have the flexibility to accommodate the schedule, I ask unanimous consent that the chairman be authorized to declare recess at any time the committee roll any request for a recorded vote. So ordered. Okay, yield myself 5 minutes. The Budget Act was created 50 years ago this year. If we gave it a grade on its ability to guide the budget process, right here as we get to another CR, I'm going to take your talking points here, believe it or not. But it's not just the Republican dysfunction, it's Democrat and Republican dysfunction. I think there's only been 4 times when we've ever done all 12 appropriations bills and a budget in that 50-year span. We don't pass budgets on time, we don't consider budgets, we don't debate them like we should, we don't implement them like we should, we don't offset costs. This is crazy. But my Democrat colleagues actually came up with a great idea in 2010, statutory pay-go. And it basically said if we spend on mandatory spending above and beyond the baseline, we have to offset it. Either side, whether it's tax or it's spending. And do you know that since 2010, we haven't enforced that pay-go, statutory pay-go, not 1 year. Do you know how much money that we have failed to offset? $12 trillion. So this thing is off the chain bad. And we've got to make some changes, and we've got to find agreement where we can to change it. I think we owe it to the American people to do the right thing by the people's government in stewardship of their resources, and we owe it to them to work together when we can to make this process function efficiently, where they are providing this critical information on scoring bills, on looking at a 10-year outlook, projecting economic conditions, also we can do the cost-benefit analysis on the policies that we are proposing to solve the biggest problems facing our great country. This is not a partisan exercise. And I want to say a few things about that, and I appreciate my ranking member. He's leaned in to working with me when he can, and when in good conscience he can. Where we have disagreements, and we do that respectfully, and I appreciate that. But I just say, a new day has dawned in the Budget Committee, and we're going to have vehement disagreements, and we're going to have impassioned debate, but we, I think, have been more collegial, and we have done more intentional work to find bipartisan common ground than past budget committees, maybe since the 1974 Budget Act. We've passed 10 process reforms out of 11 on a bipartisan basis. And the first unanimously supported bipartisan budget reform in the House and Senate that the president will soon sign and become law, that's your bill that I support. And that's progress right there. We've talked about a bipartisan fiscal commission. Scott Peters is a leader on that. I think I don't want to wait another 50 years to see if we can let this process yield solutions to the $127 trillion additional unfunded liability into the future. And Mr. Peters, you've said it yourself. If we do nothing, for example, on Social Security, every Social Security beneficiary, every senior is going to take a 20% hit. So what did I do? I said, hey, put it all on the table. Put spending and programmatic reforms and pay-fors on the table, because I think that's how we're going to end up solving that together, because no party is unilaterally going to do it. No party's done it this far. Don't you agree? We need to get back to what Reagan and Tip O'Neill did on that. I feel like we've done some good things together, and I think today's hearing and the 6 reform bills are in that same vein of common sense, straightforward solutions to governing and to stewarding taxpayer resources. And I hope we can continue to work together and make progress. I know that's your intent, Mr. Ranking Member, and I just love this opportunity to address what I think is the biggest challenge facing this country, and that's the unsustainable fiscal path we're on. We have ideas on pro-growth tax policies. Y'all have ideas on programs like paid family leave and new programs and expanded programs on Obamacare. Hey, at the end of the day, the American people are going to vote what they think is the best path for our country. What we have to agree, no matter what direction we go, is that we're not going to defer the tax to our children, and we're not going to defer the bill and the cost of this government on our kids. At $35 trillion and over World War II levels of indebtedness, we simply can't do it. So I look forward to the hearing, and I yield the 5 minutes for your opening remarks, and I appreciate my colleagues being as impassioned as I am about these matters that affect everything we do on behalf of the American people. I yield.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and based on what you said, let me start off in a way I didn't plan to, and I would say that our first day here, you as chair, me as ranking member in January last year, you set the tone immediately, and I followed up in my speech that we would be doing serious work in this committee. I said that there are certain areas in the House where it's a place more appropriate for food fights and the silly nonsense that gets covered a lot, but this wouldn't be one of them. And I can say, even with disagreements that we may have substantively, including on some bills today, you have lived up to that, and I deeply appreciate it and working with you. And that will continue, I am highly confident, in the months and years ahead in this committee. Excuse me. Now, moving into more of why we're here for this markup, while I appreciate the sincere work that some folks have done on these bills, I think today is a missed opportunity. I would point to the bill, and the chairman was kind to call it my bill. I would say it was our bill, the CBO Data Sharing Act. That is the first win for this committee in how many years, Mr. Chairman? Bill, as he just pointed out, with the both of us as lead co-sponsors, that unanimously passed this committee, unanimously passed the House, just passed the Senate unanimously, and will soon be signed into law by this president. Other bills have also been passed out of this committee, including, by the way, with Republicans as sponsors, but a lot of bipartisan support. I was hoping that today could have been a bipartisan markup, and am disappointed that we have 6 bills on the docket, all of which are coming from the Republican side. So I hope, at least in the future, that we will be able to get back to doing that on a bipartisan basis. Now, as for the substance, I am interested in good common sense reforms, as I know you are, Mr. Chairman, that strengthen the Congressional Budget Office and strengthen our ability as members of Congress to do our job. I am not interested in bills that, in my view, and I think in the view of many of us on this side of the aisle, blame the nonpartisan government employees of the Congressional Budget Office for failures that are actually the failures of Congress, that are the failures of this institution to do its job. Once again, we're here at the last minute, and we need to do a continuing resolution. When we last met a week ago, it was, I recall, the morning after the Speaker Johnson go-it-alone, Republican-only effort that also included a poison pill had failed by some 20 votes on the House floor. It was obvious to everyone for months that the only way to get a budget agreement with a Republican House with a very narrow majority that often relies on Democratic votes, and a Democratic Senate and a Democrat in the White House as president, that we needed to have a bipartisan solution to this budget agreement. At the very least, if we need more time, which clearly we do, it would have to be a bipartisan continuing resolution. I'm glad that finally Republican leadership came to the obvious conclusion that the rest of us had months ago, and that today we will have a vote on the House floor to avoid a government shutdown. And you will see a big Democratic majority, again, carrying that vote. So as we move forward, I hope to work on other pieces of legislation in the months ahead. We still have a lot of time between now and January when we can get good things done. And we will continue to work in good faith and support bills that we can genuinely agree on and that we think improve the system, but not those that attempt to shift the blame from those of us who are elected to do the job of passing budgets on time. And with that, I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman, my ranking member, for his remarks. Just with a point of privilege, I'd like to introduce for the record this and call everybody's attention to a great article by Kevin Kosar from the Washington Examiner about the budget productivity of this committee. He says, believe it or not, the House Budget Committee is getting things done. And that should be something that everybody on this committee is proud of, and I hope we continue to defy the expectations based on past performance. In the interest of time, if any other member has an opening statement, I ask that you submit it for the record. I will hold the record open to the end of the day to accommodate those members who may not yet have prepared written statements. The committee will now proceed to the consideration of H.R. 9716, the Increasing Baseline Update Act, led by the Budget Committee colleagues of ours, Mr. Moore of Utah and Mr. Swazi of New York. This legislation will help us return to the Congressional Budget Office, providing 3 baseline updates per year, allowing us to better respond to the ever-changing, especially in recent years, the ever-changing economic conditions. I ask unanimous consent that the first reading of the bill be dispensed with. The bill be considered as read and open to the amendment at any point, that the reading of any amendments be dispensed with without objection, so ordered. There'll be up to 10 minutes debate for this bill with time equally divided. Now recognize my colleague and friend, Mr. Moore, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thanks for holding this important markup today of policies related to the Congressional Budget Office, or the CBO. We've had Director Swagel in numerous times working on a good faith approach on some of the key important reforms that need to take place. I would also like to thank Congressman and my colleague, Congressman Swazi, for co-leading this effort. Again, this bill, the Increasing Baseline Updates Act, is in today's markup, and I appreciate the chairman for including it. This bill, this Increasing Budget Baseline Updates Act, would require the CBO to produce at least 2 baseline updates per year, including at least 1 update with economic data. Currently, under the Budget Act, CBO is required to publish its baseline before February 15th of each year, but a specific number of baseline updates is not statutorily required. As a result, in recent years, CBO has not published updates to the baseline later in the calendar year. The last time CBO published a baseline update after July was in 2020, and the office has not published 3 baseline updates in a calendar year since 2019. By requiring these 2 additional baseline updates each year, the Increasing Baselines Updates Act will ensure Congress has updated information on the most relevant budget and economic figures to better inform the appropriations process and other legislative proposals we consider later in a given calendar year. The bill also ensures CBO will receive the relevant technical data from the executive branch by February 1st of each year, so CBO can complete the baseline in a timely manner. That point's, I think, important because I agree with the ranking member that a lot of this problem is Congress's fault. We don't get our stuff done on time. Now, right now, we have approximately on the House, 73% of the appropriations bills, of the total amount that needs to be appropriated, done, completed, and off our books. Now, those were largely partisan bills. We get that. That happens when Democrats are in the majority. And then the percentage that the Senate has completed is what's staggering. 0. Senate has not done 1. The fiscal deadline is next week. My point in all this is at least the House is trying. They're trying to do things on a more consistent, sensible timeline. And with that, that's what we're doing with these CBO bills today, is this isn't saying this is CBO's fault that we don't get this stuff done. We're asking CBO to do what they usually had done prior to 2020, get them back to producing more data, more information for us. Director Swagel sat there right there and said, hey, this is something we should be getting back to. Here's some of the reasons why we haven't been doing it the last few years. And so we just want to get it back to what we're doing. They provide the data to us, and we should be able to do our job. That's all we're asking here. We're not shifting blame. This Congress, the House Budget Committee, has been laser focused on sounding the alarm about the threat posed to our nation by the debt and deficit crisis in which we find ourselves. This has been accompanied by good faith efforts to work across the aisle with our Democrat colleagues on reforms to bolster improper payment accountability, improve the budget process, and shore up our long-term fiscal solvency. They're all things that everybody on this committee agrees with. Critical to our efforts to rein in the federal debt and deficit is providing oversight of CBO to ensure this office is providing Congress the most accurate and timely information to inform our legislative efforts. That's what is driving the 6 bills we're considering today's markup. Legislation House Budget Republicans worked on with our Democrat colleagues in CBO for 2 months prior to them being considered here today. I think that might be the part that's, I'm really excited to get this bill, our bill that we introduced, kind of to this point in the process, and I'm hopeful for a positive outcome. But the other legislation that we're doing today too is trying to accomplish the same thing. And I'll just make a quick mention. Like, I've seen my chairman take arrows from my side. He has put himself at risk, somewhat politically, to do so much of this in a collaborative, bipartisan way. The Fiscal Commission Act is our biggest miss this year. We didn't get it be broadly supported enough to get it over the finish line. And groups from the left and groups from the right wanted to take shots at it. And our chairman was willing to stand up and say, look, this is stuff we have to do. And we're doing the same type of stuff in the budget process. And so I really urge my Democratic colleagues to look at the holistic nature of today's bills, not all the other stuff that goes on in Congress. We all want to fix that. We can't. But this is crucial to how we go about being able to do our job better. And I strongly urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support the Increasing Baseline Updates Act and other legislation we're considering today. Put partisanship aside and advance the other common sense policies we're voting on today. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the the gentleman from Utah for his remarks, and now yield 5 minutes to our ranking member, Mr. Boyle.
Thank you, and I am happy to support Representative Moore's piece of legislation, the Increasing Baseline Updates Act, for several reasons. First, it keeps Congress informed. When CBO updates its baseline regularly, lawmakers and the public receive better estimates of proposed policy changes. The political and economic environment can be fast-moving and volatile, perhaps understatement of this year. And the most current projections of the deficit and economic activity are the ones that are most useful. Second, it enhances CBO's objectivity. Third, it provides the CBO with the data that it needs. This bill ensures that the Office of Management and Budget provides CBO with specific budget data and prevents future Republican administrations from intentionally obstructing CBO. I would also point out appreciatively that the chairman, I know, and the member improved this bill using feedback provided from CBO as well as Democratic staff. Finally, I would just say, regardless of this piece of legislation or not, I would underscore that Congress as an institution needs to do a better job of getting its budgets done on time. I have come to the conclusion that we need fundamental reform of the Budget Act of 1974. When you see failures year in and year out, I think that nothing short of fundamental reform of that piece of legislation is what's required. But as far as this bill that's in front of us today, happy to support it.
I think the gentleman, we've going to have a 1-minute closing statement. I would say I couldn't agree more about the fundamental reform on the 74 Budget Act. And whether it's ideas over here or ideas over there, we're going to move our way to bigger structural changes. These are the low-hanging fruit opportunities. Mr. Moore, close us out for a minute.
Thank you, Chairman, and I am thrilled to have Ranking Member Boyle's support on this bill. It's a step in the right direction on getting to that point that both the chairman and the ranking member agree on major reform needed. We do need to do our work on time. I think we've got really good, solid ideas to that. This is a step to helping getting back into that direction. So thank you sincerely to the ranking member, and of course to my colleague, Mr. Swazi, a fellow Mets fan, as we are tied, unfortunately, for life on this quest.
Mr. Chairman, I withdraw my support, finding out Mr. Moore is a Mets fan. As a Phillies fan, thank you.
And we're right there at the wild card race. So thank you, and hope to have more and more productive outcomes like this going forward. Yield back.
Since his comment was not made in order, we still have the bipartisan support for your bill. And I thank the gentleman from Utah. Since there are no amendments, I now recognize gentleman from Utah for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that H.R. 9716 be reported to the House with the recommendation that the bill do pass.
Question is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I request that a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested. We, as per our agreement, will postpone the recorded vote until later in the markup. Committee now will proceed to the consideration of H.R. 9751, the Executive Action Cost Transparency Act, led by our Budget Committee colleagues, Mr. Ron Estes of Kansas. This legislation will consolidate the costs of administrative and judicial actions in a central location, making it easier for us to track spending by the executive branch. Right now, you have to pore over and dig through a lot of data to find out what executive actions have taken place and how much they cost. This administration has taken more executive actions than any in the history of the presidency, and at a cost of $2 trillion. But if a Republican were to be president, I would support the same transparency and denoting their executive actions and cost. It should go both ways, and it does for me. We need this fixed. So I ask unanimous consent to the first Reading of the bill be dispensed with. The bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point, and that the reading of any amendments be dispensed with without objection. So ordered. 10 minutes, again, evenly divided. Now recognize my friend from Kansas, Mr. Estes, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate the opportunity to mark up these critical bills to reform the Congressional Budget Office, including my bill, the Executive Action and Cost Transparency Act. Mr. Chairman, as members of the Budget Committee, we're responsible for producing a budget that will guide spending for the next fiscal year in a fiscally responsible manner. While we know our budget and appropriations processes are broken, I want to commend you, Mr. Chairman, for making sure that this committee actually follows through with our work and passes budgets, with our budget this year being the second time in 30 years that we've passed a budget before the president's budget was released. However, in order to accurately produce a budget, we need to have all the facts, and that's going to require things like this minor information awareness for us in terms of changing how the Congressional Budget Office does some of its processes. I mean, CBO already factors executive and judicial actions into their baseline, and my bill would not change that practice at all. However, CBO does not delineate the cost of each of these individual actions as they are factored into the baseline or provided as baseline updates as a resource for members, staff, or the general public. This reform simply requires the CBO to pull out a separate table of judicial and executive actions that meet a threshold of $50 billion over 10 years, information that's already included in their baseline. In essence, the bill provides more transparency by delineating the cost of each of these actions that CBO factors in so that Congress and the American people can have a resource to understand the cost of those executive actions. When lawmakers don't have access to the details of non-legislative spending, it's like a family or small business making financial decisions while someone else is spending some of the money on unknown goods or services. Today, when our national debt is at $35.3 trillion and climbing, we still have to have accountability and transparency over all federal spending. The chairman has been using the phrase reverse the curse to talk about the detriment of our national debt and the need to change course, and we don't even know how bad that curse is, which is why we need to reform bills that we're discussing today. Administration after administration, both Republican and Democrat, have issued costly executive actions that over the last several decades have increased their national debt and continue to have an impact. For example, in just the last 3.5 years alone, the Biden-Harris administration has issued over 130 executive actions that have cost taxpayers more than $2 trillion, not to mention additional judicial and administrative actions in that time, demonstrating just how costly non-legislative actions can be. And it's going to continue into the future unless we do something like this, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat that's in the White House. My Executive Action Cost Transparency Act would require the CBO to provide a comprehensive and centralized list of costly administrative actions since their last baseline or baseline update in order to increase the transparency and streamline information flow. This would provide us in Congress and the American people with needed details on DC's spending, which would include proposed rules, final rules, executive orders, memorandums, and judicial actions since the last baseline that met a threshold of $50 billion over 10 years. This bill isn't controversial, it just makes sense. There isn't anything in this bill that should prevent Democrats and Republicans from voting in favor of this legislation. It's a bill that increases transparency. CBO already factors the executive and judicial actions into their baseline, but doesn't break out those details in a separate resource for Congress. As lawmakers elected by our constituents, we should know how much our government is spending on things before we pass new legislation and spend more money. And quite frankly, the American people deserve to know as well. I'm grateful that on this committee we have members who understand the need to tackle our national debt and who are willing to vote in favor of common sense reforms like the one I'm offering today. While not perfect, the CBO is our best way to gauge legislation and understand its costs to taxpayers. Having timely and accurate information is imperative to help us make the best decisions for the individuals and families we represent. I can't fathom why members would vote against this bill, since so many members say that they want more transparency in government. This bill is providing another tool to help us to address the national debt crisis we face today, something that most of us, Democrats and Republicans, recognize as a very real threat to our nation. Voting against this bill would be telling your constituents that you're against transparency and accountability. I urge my colleagues, Republican and Democrat, to join me in reforming the CBO and bringing greater transparency and accountability to administrative activity. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman from Kansas and now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
And I will yield my time to my colleague from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. I think there is no purpose at all for this legislation, and it seems to me that it's really more of a press release than really and disguised in the form of a bill. The purpose, I think, is only to attack the Biden administration and for things like trying to protect children and seniors and families and students. I am very much against it. This is the richest country in the world at the richest time in history, and certainly we should not be pointing out what the Republicans view as wasteful spending. You know, right at this moment, currently over 40 million Americans rely on the SNAP program in order to be able to put the food that they need on the table. And that is just, it's unacceptable to use examples like that as something that we need to cut down. And so I know that there's also a great deal of protest against student loans and all the things that we are doing for our older Americans. So I just I urge a no vote on this legislation. We don't need to do this. It is redundant and unnecessary, and I plan to vote no and encourage my colleagues to do the same. Thank you.
I thank the gentlelady and now yield 1 minute in closing to Mr. Estes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, as we look at the bill, and one of the things that we have responsibility in the committee is to look at how do we address where we are with the federal budget, how much we address with the national debt that's out there. And this small change in terms of how the CBO reports the information that they have provides much more transparency, and it'll help keep members informed, because at the end of the day, we have the responsibility to address how much money is spent at the federal level. It doesn't change any programs. It doesn't change any of the executive actions in particular. It just makes sure that we have more information so that we can do the job that we were elected to do. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
In the 18 seconds remaining, President Trump took executive actions, for example, to secure the border. I want to know how much that cost so we can evaluate cost benefit. I want to know if it's within the parameters of the executive branch, because I take Article 1 seriously. President Biden has done the same with student loans. I don't care what the issue is. We need that information to hold these executives accountable and also protect our Article 1 authority. And with that, since there aren't any amendments, I now recognize the gentleman from Kansas for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that H.R. 9751 be reported to the House with the recommendation that the bill do pass.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Mr. Estes.
Mr. Chairman, on
yes,
that,
sir.
I request a recorded vote.
See how I anticipated that? A recorded vote is requested, but we will postpone that recorded vote to later in the markup per our agreement. The committee will now proceed to the consideration of H.R. 9714, the CBO Oversight Act, led by our Budget Committee colleagues, Mr. Ralph Norman, Ms. McLean of Michigan, and Mr. Greg Lopez of Colorado. This legislation will require the Budget Committee to hold regular hearings with the CBO Director which is our constitutional oversight responsibility in order to reinforce this committee's efforts to do its job. I ask unanimous consent that the first reading of the bill be dispensed with. The bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. The reading of any amendments be dispensed with without objection. So ordered. We're going to continue with 5 and 5 and 1 to close. I now recognize my friend and colleague, Mr. Norman, for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you, your work all year long. This is pretty straightforward bill that basically requires CBO to come before the House budget and/or the Senate 2 times a year. You know, if you look in the private sector, most companies have meetings at least once a month, and regardless of the size, and most companies, and we have a small company, meet every week. And I'm sure Ms. McLean and her, with her business, the same way. I think Mr. Lopez, probably the same thing, but this isn't too much to ask. I would remind my friends on the opposite side of the aisle, the CBO answers to the taxpayer, and to give a report is not too much. Now, let me go over what kind of money we're talking about. How many employees on the CBO? 285, 278 are full-time. What is the cost? They're requesting $65.5 million for salaries and benefits. Those salaries, if you do it if you do the math on it, it's $229,824 per individual. They ask for it represents an increase in personnel costs of $3.7 million. So they're asking for a 6% increase. They also got one last year. So of the total amount, $47.1 million would cover salaries, an increase of $2.3 million. And the CBO director's salary ranges from $230,000 to $340,000. So the math is pretty astronomical, and to ask the CBO to come forward, I think is an easy ask to make. With that, I think I'm out of time, so I'll yield back.
I yield 2 minutes to Ms. McLean of Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of our most important jobs as members of Congress is actually the oversight of federal agencies. That actually includes the Congressional Budget Office, right? I was looking forward to a bipartisan good, markup, good governance of this oversight of the CBO. But what I think is really interesting and coincidental, not that I'm much for coincidences, is at the 11th hour, the Democrats announced their opposition to this bill that requires the CBO director to testify in front of the Budget Committee no less than twice a year. So we're asking for an agency to testify and do their job in front of Congress twice a year. Seriously? That's too much to ask? I mean, we're joking on this, right? I am so out of bounds, and Mr. Norman, excuse me, this bill is so out of bounds to ask the CBO director, to do his job, by the way, to come in and testify twice a year in front of Congress. Wow. I mean, that's a heavy lift, Mr. Norman. Clearly, I'm being sarcastic. What's the problem with oversight and accountability? It's our job to be good stewards of the taxpayers' dollars and to know when we're spending the money wisely and when we're spending the money not so wisely. I mean, it's not like the CBO ever is off on anything, right? I mean, it's not like the CBO was off by $1 trillion on their projection of the revenue collection after the Trump middle tax cuts. $1 trillion! But hey, that's a lot to ask for the CBO director to come and explain that. Or what about the $124 billion that they were off on the EV credits? That's just a lot to ask for. I don't understand. The Democrats have no problem spending your money, But when it comes time to being accountable for the taxpayer money, whoa, that's just a bridge too far. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady and yield the last minute or so to Mr. Greg Lopez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, it is amazing to hear that there's an opposition in having someone come and explain to the committee the numbers, explain the rationale. I'm curious to see if the argument may be that he's too busy, there's really no reason for us to have more information, that less information is better. You know what, and one of the things that, you know, I don't come from a big education, but I will share with you that my grandfather used to tell me, you know what, there's only two things you can give away, and that is your integrity and your word. And if you say you're gonna do something, you should do it, you should honor it. It's my understanding that my brothers and sisters on the Democrat side have not been receiving that message of wisdom, because all we're asking is for someone to appear twice a year. Are they trying to protect someone, or are they just trying to be obstructionists? I urge all my colleagues to support this bill because it is common sense, and it is something that the people will respect and will appreciate, that they have an opportunity to hear from the head of the Congressional Budget Office.
I thank the gentleman from Colorado. Now you have 5 minutes to the ranking member.
Well, before I recognize and yield, actually, first let me reverse the order. Let me recognize the gentleman from the Commonwealth of Virginia, and then if there's any time remaining, I'll just add one more point. So I yield to Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the ranking member for yielding. Mr. Chairman, this bill manufactures a problem where none exists. The Congressional Budget Office provides a vital service to us. We have no opposition to people testifying. The CBO, in fact, the CBO director has always responded to requests to testify. No CBO director has ever refused to testify before the House or Senate budget committees when they have been invited. In fact, this budget committee majority failed to invite the CBO to testify at all during all of 2023. Legislation shifts the blame to CBO when the responsibility to invite the director is on the majority, which they have failed. The bill also threatens the CBO's integrity. My Republican colleagues are using this bill to imply that the CBO is not being cooperative when in fact officials at the CBO have made themselves readily available. Legislation suggests that the CBO is not responsive to the budget committees, which is false. CBO is very responsive to the committees and members of Congress in general. We saw this just 2 weeks ago when the director came here to testify after being invited. We also know that CBO provides an enormous amount of data to legislators with limited staff and resources, and this is just an attempt to undermine and politicize CBO by micromanaging the agency. House Republicans are legislating something where no legislation is needed, suggesting the CBO is not cooperating when in fact the director is not invited to testify to the committee is another example of the Republicans trying to shift the burden of the fiscal responsibility onto somebody else. It's consistent with former President Trump's Project 2025 goal to sabotage nonpartisan government agencies. And it's also an attempt to shift the blame for fiscal irresponsibility away from the Republican Party where it belongs. I just want to, the chair's opening statement said, you know, both sides at fault. Wrong. I want to remind everybody that every Democratic presidential administration since Kennedy has left for their Republican successors a better deficit than they inherited. And every Republican administration since Nixon has left a worse deficit situation for the Democrats, without exception, for over 70 years. So it's not both sides, and it's certainly not the fault of the CBOs, and therefore I oppose the bill and yield back.
And we yield back the time.
Okay.
I thank the gentleman from Virginia.
Thank the gentleman, and now yield the closing statement to Mr. Ralph Norman.
Let me just add that when the Democrats had to control the House for the last 6 years, how many times did they call up the CBO? 0. Over the last decade, how many times has the CBO appeared? In the House, it appeared eight times. In the Senate budget, 5 times. That's over the last decade. How many businesses would be outraged over a Office 2 that was $1 trillion over what they estimated? Would you keep that person on your business? No, you would not. I lost credibility when they said the border crisis, the invasion at the border was going to be a positive cash flow for the government. How does that work? So this is it's amazing we even have to discuss this, and it's amazing me that my Democrat friends are opposing something that you take it to the taxpayer. I think they would demand this. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman. Since there are no amendments, I now recognize the gentleman from South Carolina for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the H.R. 9714 be reported to the House with a recommendation that the bill passes.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I request a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested. We will postpone that vote until the end of the hearing per our agreement, my agreement with the ranking member. The committee will now proceed to the consideration of H.R. 9711, the Congressional Budget Office Scheduling Reform Act, led by our Budget Committee colleague, Mr. David Valadeo of California. This legislation will create a comprehensive public release schedule for major reports by the CBO. I will tell you as chairman, you may very well get your chance to be the chairman one day. I suspect if history's any guide that Democrats will be in charge at some point. It will be frustrating to you as it has me that the reports that they do that are important reports, whether their accuracy is there or not, we need to know when those reports are coming down the pike. Democrats and Republicans need to be briefed on it, and we need more discipline and rigor in the system, and that doesn't exist today. So I appreciate, Mr. Valadeo, your straightforward common sense reform here by asking for this schedule. I ask unanimous consent for the first reading of the bill to be dispensed with. The bill be considered as read. An open amendment at any point, and the reading of any amendments be dispensed with without objection, so ordered. Again, 10 minutes evenly divided, and 1 minute to close. Mr. Valadeo, I yield 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. My bill, the Congressional Budget Office Scheduling Reform Act, is a common sense step toward enhancing transparency, accountability, and efficiency in the way Congress handles the budget process. This bill builds on efforts by the Congressional Budget Office to communicate better with Congress about its upcoming releases. The CBO's reports are an important tool for helping Congress manage the fiscal health of our country. In the past, we haven't always had much notice about when these reports will be released, and I'm grateful for the CBO's cooperation in our efforts to create a clear release schedule, which will ensure that both lawmakers and the public have consistent access to this vital information. This prevents any surprises that could disrupt our legislative process and helps keep the CBO accountable to its role as a nonpartisan provider of budgetary analysis. Because the congressional calendar can change, this bill requires CBO to update the schedule as necessary to ensure it is as accurate as possible. This bill also facilitates better planning. Lawmakers depend heavily on the CBO's reports to make informed decisions about the budget and key policy issues. With a more established and longer-term schedule, Congress will be able to plan our work more effectively and better align timelines and strategies with the release of essential data. In addition, this bill also encourages efficiency within the CBO itself. By formalizing a release schedule, we give the CBO a framework to prioritize its workload and allocate resources to meet these deadlines without sacrificing quality. Another important aspect of this bill is how it helps increase public confidence in the budgeting process. As we all know, the CBO's reports are not just used by us here in Congress, they're used by the public, businesses, investors, and other stakeholders who rely on CBO data to understand the fiscal health of our country. By moving toward a predictable release schedule, we send a clear message that we take fiscal transparency seriously and that we are committed to providing accurate, timely data that people can trust. This legislation will help ensure that Congress and the public has timely access to the information we need to make responsible fiscal decisions. It's a small but significant step toward making our budgetary process more transparent, more accountable, and ultimately more effective for the American people. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back.
I thank Mr. Valadeo and now recognize our ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe this bill is unnecessary and, again, falsely implies that CBO is not keeping the public informed about its publications, which it already does. The bill suggests CBO is not carrying out its statutory responsibilities, which is patently false. Additionally, the bill only specifies 3 items but excludes several other statutory reports that are not contemplated in this legislation. CBO right now currently tracks its, quote, major recurring reports, and any observer can see the expected timeline of most of CBO's major products. You know, and this is, you can see a consistent theme here. It's not like I'm in love with every CBO estimate. There are certainly times that they will release a score of a bill or estimates that I disagree with, where I think they got it wrong. It's often the case that sometimes you think the referee is right, sometimes you think the referee is wrong. But beating up on the nonpartisan professional office that provides us this data is not appropriate. And that has been a consistent theme that I think is wrong and needs to stop and won't, in the end of the day, help us get where we need to go as a Congress and as a country. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the ranking member. Now yield to our friend from Indiana for closing remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm deeply disappointed that many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are planning to oppose most of the bills today. Which have been, by the way, negotiated in good faith for 2 months towards what we understand to be a goal of not only bipartisanship, but actually making the budget process work better for the American people. Mr. Chairman, to illustrate these efforts, I request unanimous consent to enter into the record a timeline outlining the interactions between our 2 sides concerning this markup and a record of the proposed Democrat changes that we incorporated into these bills in good faith.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you.
Uh, 10 seconds remaining. I don't think it's too much as a board of directors to ask our CEO to know what reports they're doing and to have those on time and to make sure we get a previewed copy of it as a board of directors on both sides. I'm without any words to rationalize why we wouldn't do this, but with that, there are no amendments. Recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Valadeo, for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that H.R. 9711 be reported to the House with the recommendation that the bill do pass.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, on that, I request a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested, and we will postpone those votes to the end of the hearing per the agreement. The committee will now proceed to the consideration of H.R. 8068, the Stop the Baseline Bloat Act of 2024, led by our Budget Committee colleague, Mr. Grothman of Wisconsin, and our Democrat colleague, Mr. Ed Case of Hawaii. This legislation moves one-time emergency and supplemental appropriations from CBO's baseline, which will provide a more accurate picture of discretionary spending. I'll let him explain that. Again, I think pretty straightforward. I ask unanimous consent that the first reading of the bill be dispensed with. The bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point, and that the reading of any amendments be dispensed with without objection, so ordered. 5 minutes and 5 minutes, one to close. Mr. Grothman, I yield 2.5 minutes to you.
If we can get through this in 2.5 minutes. Our national debt now stands at an astronomical $35 trillion. $35 trillion. We passed, this unconscionably large debt is the result of decades of wasteless Washington spending So far in 2024, we spent $870 billion on interest costs. That's more than we spend on either Medicare or military. Unbelievable. One reason for the rise of Reading in recent years has been the use and abuse of emergency spending. Emergency spending is exempt from the spending caps imposed by the Fiscal Responsibility Act. Last year, Congress designated $162 billion in emergency spending. This year, it's up to $196 billion. This culture of rampant emergency spending is encouraged by the CBO's baseline budget. By law, the CBO is required to assume any spending Congress designates as emergency spending will continue throughout the entire 10-year budget window and grow with inflation. Keep in mind, emergency spending was supposed to be one-time spending, not spending that goes on in perpetuity. But you never know it the way the CBO constructs its baseline budget. In fact, the most recent CBO baseline update demonstrates the need for this bill. In June, CBO raised the projected spending over the next 10 years by $945 billion. That was before we tried to pass a discharge petition with another $200 billion in it yesterday. I hope we can get some bipartisan help in stopping that thing when it gets to the floor. Please. We want some bipartisan help. Does it make sense for the CBO to assume this temporary foreign aid spending will continue and grow throughout all 10 years of the budget window? To address this distortion of the baseline, I've been pleased to work with Congressman Case of Hawaii. What a great guy. To introduce the Stop This Baseline Bloat Act. This simple bill would amend the Balanced Budget and Emergency Deficit Control Act of 1985 to remove emergency spending from the baseline. This bill refines the baseline to reflect accurate long-term fiscal obligations by separating emergency one-time spending from regular ongoing expenditures. Getting our fiscal house in order starts with a neutral baseline, and this bill will make a meaningful step towards that goal. Thanks to Congressman Case for co-leading the Stop the Baseline Bloat Act with me, and I encourage all my colleagues in the House and Budget Committee to support the bill. And I look forward to our ranking member here helping us do something to prevent that ridiculous discharge petition from becoming law.
I thank the gentleman from Wisconsin. Now yield the remaining of the time to Mr. Buddy Carter from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank my colleague from Wisconsin for introducing this very important bill. H.R. 8068 is a perfect example of a common-sense solution to our out-of-control spending problem here in America. This bill will exclude emergency funding and supplemental appropriations from CBO baseline projections. Congress has designated $12 trillion in emergency spending out of control. It's skewing our budget projections and it's distorting our fiscal outlook. The Congressional Budget Office should not be assuming that all discretionary spending, including one-time emergency spending, remain in the budget baseline each year. This leads towards a bias of higher spending. H.R. 8068 is a simple solution to create more accurate and transparent accounting of federal spending by removing emergency spending and supplement appropriations from CBO's baseline. Emergency spending will still be tracked and reported, but it should not distort baseline budget projections. CBO projections are intended to reflect recurring costs, not extraordinary and temporary ones. H.R. 8068 will also not impact the real cost of running the government. One-time expenditures in a baseline create inaccurate portrayals of ongoing cost. This leads to higher spending and has contributed to the disastrous debt situation we find ourselves in today. Look, we've got to get a handle on our spending. This is something that our children and our children's children will have to deal with. We owe it to them to do anything in our power to get a handle on this. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this bipartisan solution to our spending problem. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
I thank the gentleman from Georgia and yield to the ranking member for 5 minutes.
I'm happy to yield to my colleague, gentleman from New York, Mr. Espiat.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Thank you, Chairman. I rise in opposition of this Stop the Baseline Bloat Act. This bill would needlessly exclude emergency spending from being included in CBO's baseline. Emergency spending is a crucial part of the budget and has been necessary throughout the years as Americans have weathered a global pandemic and increasingly frequent natural disasters. As we speak today, Mr. Chairman, as we speak today, Florida is bracing for Tropical Storm Helene. I don't know if anybody tuned into the Weather Channel this morning, but if you did, you will know that Helene is on its way to hit Florida right on its face. Helene, which is a forecast, forecasters are predicted may be a Category 4 storm that will devastate Florida and other southern states. And we must be prepared to provide support for these communities. This is not out of control spending. This is emergency spending. Not only must we pass legislation that will financially aid the communities, we must also pass legislation which will increase access to disaster relief for underserved communities that don't have typical proof of home ownership, like my bill, H.R. 5324, the Housing Survivor of Major Disasters Bill. When a storm like Helene hits our territory, often FEMA asks for original deeds of property, original deeds that may have been passed down for 4 or 5 generations. When New York City needed to rebuild after Hurricane Sandy, we relied on $49 billion in emergency funding. It would be ridiculous to exclude this funding entirely from the baseline and would provide a less accurate picture of spending trends. When Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico and devastated Puerto Rico, we also had to rely on emergency spending. So as we brace for Tropical Storm Helene that will become a Category 4 hurricane, it is mind-boggling that in this committee room, we're saying that we should not have any emergency help for those communities that would undoubtedly be devastated. Overall, this bill is unnecessary because the Budget Committee already receives additional data and projections that exclude emergency spending from our informational purposes. To actually create a budget, we must account for all spending. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
I think the gentleman from New York, he's a good guy. I like working with him. But let's be clear for the record on what we're trying to do here. We're not saying that there shouldn't be an account for emergency spending. There are unpredictable, unforeseen events that happen. We want to be there for our fellow Americans. But to leave, for example, Ukraine funding, the supplemental, recent supplemental, to leave that as an expense every year for 10 years in the baseline that amounts to $1 trillion is just ridiculous. We're not saying that we shouldn't be there for emergencies. We're saying that the emergency spending shouldn't be there in a 10-year baseline. And so I also have ideas about the fact that we should budget for emergencies and we should pay for emergencies. We don't do either on either side, by the way. But that's not the issue at hand. I'm going to let Mr. Grothman close it out, and then we'll move on to the next bill. Mr. Grothman.
Yeah, we're going to still do something down there for the hurricane. It just means that for planning overall, it's not part of the budget baseline. Again, remember, we got this discharge petition for $180 billion the other day that this committee ought to take up and wonder what the hell is going on here. But I move that H.R. 8068, as amended, be reported by the House with the...
I'm going to not accept that motion because I want to, unless are you finished with your final
I'm done,
comments?
yeah.
Okay, let me then get to unanimous consent. I'm asking for unanimous consent now to consider any technical amendments offered by Mr. Grothman at the desk. This amendment corrects a parenthetical reference in the introduced bill. The clerk will designate the amendment. The staff will distribute copies of that amendment so we can fix this technical issue. And I'll pause now for everybody to get a copy of this change.
A technical amendment to H.R. 8068 offered by Mr. Grothman.
I'm waiting for them to call me back to that. It's getting ready to, it's getting close to.
show you just how much we care about the details, Mr. Espiat, we took a capital C, parenthetically, to a lowercase c. And so now I would ask my colleagues on the other side of that, would that change your mind? Is that compelling enough? Okay.
Mr. Chairman, in the interest of bipartisanship, we will not object to the technical amendment changing the big C to a little c.
Well, if I've ever seen a profile encouraged, Mr. Rankin. That doesn't count, Mr. Kildee. Okay. Without objection, the amendment is agreed to. Since there are no further amendments, to my knowledge, I now recognize the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman, for a motion.
Okay, I move that H.R. 8068 is amended, be reported to the House with the recommendation that the bill does pass.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill as amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
I request a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested. We'll postpone that to the end of the hearing per our agreement. The committee will now proceed to the consideration of H.R. 9686, the Health Panel Act. Led by Budget Committee colleagues Mr. Carter of Georgia, Dr. Burgess of Texas, this legislation would codify CBO's panel of health advisors, I think much like MedPAC, with the Ways and Means Committee and E&C, ensuring that healthcare policy is informed by a diverse set of ideological perspectives and, I think most importantly, technical expertise. I ask unanimous consent that the reading of this bill be dispensed with, the bill be considered as read, and open to amendment at any point, and that the reading of any amendments be dispensed with. Without objection, so ordered. 10 minutes, 5 and 5, 1 to close. Mr. Buddy Carter of Georgia for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Health Panel Act is another piece of common sense legislation I'm spearheading with my friend and one of my mentors, Dr. Burgess. As a pharmacist serving in Congress, healthcare issues are important to me, and I understand how CBO's cost estimates have a profound impact on the legislative process, especially for healthcare, often determining whether or not a healthcare bill can move through the committee process. That's why it's imperative for CBO to rely on the best available data to inform your work on healthcare and legislation. 20 years ago, CBO informally established the panel of health advisors, and there's no statutory authority for this panel. In fact, there's no clear guidance on the purpose, duty, or function of the panel. Currently, members of panel of health advisors are appointed solely on the discretion of the CBO director, without any requirement to seek nominations or feedback from the budget committees or any other congressional offices. Myself, along with other members of this committee, are concerned that the vesting sole appointment authority in one individual, the panel is not inclusive of different ideological positions and fails to accurately represent a range of stakeholders with expertise across the healthcare sector. The Health Panel Act fixes this problem. This legislation will help improve the accuracy of CBO's scores on bills related to healthcare by codifying the panel of health advisors, establishing congressional appointment authority, and requiring an annual report to the budget committees detailing the panel's work and recommendations. The Health Panel Act is a necessary, common sense step to improve both cost estimates and congressional oversight of this key panel. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this essential piece of legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank the gentleman from Georgia. Now yield to Dr. Burgess for 2.5 minutes.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank Mr. Carter for his work on this legislative product. Look, over for 20 years, former practicing physician, now a member of Congress, I've learned that the CBO score plays a determinative role to either advance or stop the development of healthcare policy. CBO's analysis of budgetary and real-world consequences of healthcare legislation can either boost a policy through passage into law or stop a bill altogether. We all remember how significantly the CBO overestimated the cost of Part D in 2003 and how woefully it underestimated the cost of the Affordable Care Act in 2009. The panel of health advisors was established over 20 years ago, and it lacks any statutory authority. Its duties and responsibilities are unclear. The legislation we're considering today would codify the panel of health advisors, establish congressional appointment authority, impose important responsibilities, and require an annual report to the Budget Committee detailing the panel's work and the recommendations. Last fall, the Healthcare Task Force, which Chairman Arrington asked me to lead, had a roundtable examining the Inflation Reduction Act's effects on new medicines reaching patients. We brought in an independent health economist, a life sciences investor, a former CBO director to examine the CBO's innovation model that projected that only one fewer drug would be coming to market over 10 years because of the IRA Medicare drug price controls. But in fact, every other individual and group that evaluated this said that number was significantly larger. So why the discrepancy? Why only one fewer drug from the Congressional Budget Office, and some groups as many as 20 or 25? And what about the damage to the underlying ecosystem of drug development in this country? And the CBO director had no answer for that. But this is the type of work that this CBO panel of health advisors should be doing in order to ensure that the models are the most accurate work products. We all know healthcare is the primary driver of our over $35 trillion national debt. The healthcare sector makes up 1/5 the United States economy, so the need for accurate estimates of healthcare policies that support effective policymaking could not be clearer. We see examples of this in other agencies as well. And Mr. Chairman, I would like to ask unanimous consent to place into the record a letter from Mr. Norman, our colleague, back from 2021, looking at a problem that exists with the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee at the Science Advisory Board at the EPA, where all of the science advisors that had been appointed by the previous administration were subsequently fired because they weren't giving the results that were wanted. This is an important concept, and we need to pay attention.
With that objection, so ordered.
I'll yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Now you have 5 minutes to the ranking member.
And I'm happy to yield to the gentleman from the great state of Texas, Mr. Doggett.
Well, thank you very much. I doubt that there is any member of Congress, whether it's on a health care bill or anything else, that hasn't had a complaint about CBO. The delays, the cost, the numbers that come back, the fact that all of us from different perspectives have at one point or another questioned CBO may be an indication that they probably get it about as close to right as can be. The only healthcare concern that I've heard raised to justify this bill is the one that Dr. Burgess just referred to concerning the number of cures that would be lost as a result of the important price negotiation legislation. He's unhappy that they did not accept a lot of the big pharma propaganda and only said that the final bill would cost one drug. I think that's probably one too many from my perspective. The industry claimed that they need to charge Americans the highest prices in the world because otherwise we will lose innovation. I believe what they're experts at as far as innovation is extending monopoly pricing and delaying generic competition. Big Pharma spends more of its revenue on enriching shareholders than it does on research and development. I know that my personal attempts, when their original estimate came out on the very first version of H.R. 3 about the number of cures that would be lost, I could not get a thorough explanation of what the basis of that was, though it did seem to align with Big Pharma propaganda. It's difficult to believe that the modest savings that have been achieved now in the first round of Medicare price negotiation will have the slightest effect on research and development. Indeed, I would say that very much like the Republican attack on Obamacare, which they seem to have slacked up on a little bit and finally accepted, I just wish this price negotiation were as good as they think it is bad. Indeed, what we know, we have the results now of the negotiation that's occurred. And the negotiation that has occurred has left Americans, the few that will benefit from the prescription drug negotiation bill, paying about twice the prices that many other wealthy countries pay for the same drugs. And let me say that while I personally have been critical of the pharmaceutical industry, I think it's important to look at what the investors in the pharmaceutical industry and the investor analysts have had to say about it. The analyst at SVB Leerink, a health investment bank, said that the provisions to prevent prices from rising faster than inflation were, quote, inconsequential for the industry, end quote. Ronnie Gall, who's the Chief Strategy and Growth Officer at Novartis, put it very succinctly in his prior role as a Wall Street analyst at Bernstein. Quote, it seems designed to let legislators claim an achievement while granting pharma protection, end quote. The advisory board that exists for pharmaceutical matters and all healthcare matters at CBO today has 22 members. 6 of them have industry ties, including an Eli Lilly board member who was there to offer his input. The question presented by this amendment is whether we should totally politicize the Healthcare Advisory Board or we should leave it independent with some industry representatives and various academics. Stacking the panel with a number of additional industry representatives will not produce more accurate estimates, and it will certainly politicize one of the few institutions that we can turn to for objective analysis and accountability on our work. Some reference was made at the beginning of the discussion of this amendment about MedPAC. And while MedPAC's recommendations are too frequently rejected, Congress does not appoint MedPAC. It is an independent board, and we benefit from its objective analysis just as we do from having an independent voice at the Congressional Budget Office. The political intent here today in trying to cook the books a little bit in the way the CBO handles healthcare matters is apparent from the fact that CBO also has a separate panel of economic advisors. Yet today's legislation focuses solely on the health panel and does not consider adding appointments in a way that would politicize the economic advisors. Maybe that's next. Industry stakeholders of all backgrounds, including experts outside the health panel, have adequate consultation in the scoring process, and CBO has made it clear that they're open to any input members of Congress may want to forward them, whether it has to do with cures kept or lost or the prices involved. Giving Congress control over 75% of the appointments to the health panel and empowering these advisors with a larger, more formal role is simply a ploy to circumvent the independent analysis that CBO does. They're far from perfect. I'm far from satisfied with them, but we're better off with the independent system we have now than a politicized system, which is what this amendment would call for. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Texas. Ranking member has a comment.
Yeah, and just I did want to correct the record. It was Mr. Norman stated that under Democratic control of this committee that we never had CBO hearings. So I do want to submit for the record these dates when my predecessor, your predecessor, Mr. Chairman, John Yarmouth, the gentleman from Kentucky, 3 different occasions in recent history, January 29th, 2019, January 29th, 2020, and May 26th, 2022, all CBO hearings that were held under a Democratic majority. With that, I yield back.
I think we'd probably debate the definition of an oversight hearing, but with that, Mr. Buddy Carter, take us home.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, my friend from Texas stated that he opposed the bill due to fears that it would politicize the Congressional Budget Office panel of health advisors. Unfortunately, the fact of the matter is that the CBO panel of health advisors is already defined by politicization and crippled with political bias. In fact, according to the FEC filings, over 80% of the current panelists who made political contributions in the last 5 years donated solely to liberal candidates or left-leaning organizations. Even more concerning, not a single member on the panel made political contributions to conservative candidates or right-leaning organizations in the past 5 years. So contrary to my friend's concern, this bill seeks to depoliticize and balance the panel with equal representation of diverse viewpoints. The bill would grant equal number of appointment slots granted to both the chairs and ranking members of the Budget Committee, along with appointment slots for the CBO director. My friend, these facts make it clear. This panel is already politicized and does not represent the diverse views of either Congress, whom CBO is statutorily required to serve as their customer, or of the American people, and I urge a yes vote on this bill, and I yield back.
I thank our friend from Georgia. Since there are no amendments, I now recognize the gentleman for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that H.R. 9686 be reported to the House with the recommendation that the bill do pass.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes.
Mr. Chairman, on that, I request a recorded vote.
Request granted. We're about to roll into our votes per our agreement at the end of the hearing. The committee will now go into our voting portion of the hearing. First, the committee will vote to report H.R. 9716. Clerk, would you please read the roll?
Mr. Norman. Mr. Norman, aye. Mr. McClintock. Mr. McClintock, aye. Mr. Grothman. Mr. Grothman, aye. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Smucker, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein, aye. Mr. Good. Mr. Good, aye. Mr. Bergman. Mr. Bergman, aye. Mr. Ferguson. Mr. Ferguson. Mr. Roy. Mr. Roy, aye. Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore, aye. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes, aye. Ms. McLean. Ms. McLean, aye. Ms. Fishbach. Ms. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Yocum. Mr. Yocum, aye. Mr. Burkeen. Mr. Burkeen, aye. Mr. Edwards. Mr. Edwards, aye. Mr. Lopez. Mr. Lopez. Mr. Boyle.
Aye.
Mr. Boyle, aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Aye. Ms. Schakowsky, aye. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer, aye. Mr. Kildee. Aye. Mr. Kildee, aye. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, aye. Miss Lee. Aye. Miss Lee, aye. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Doggett, aye. Mr. Panetta. Aye. Mr. Panetta, aye. Miss Wexton. Miss Wexton. Miss Omar. Miss Omar, aye. Mr. Trone. Mr. Trone. Miss Ballant. Miss Ballant, aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Espaillat. Mr. Espaillat, aye. Mr. Swazi. Mr. Swazi, aye. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Are there any members who wish to vote or change their vote? If not, the clerk could. How does the gentleman from California vote?
Mr. Valadeo, aye.
After the clerk tabulates the votes, I'd ask that he report that.
Mr. Chairman, on the vote, there were 32 ayes and 0 nays.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. H.R. 9716 is ordered, reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. I note for the record that a quorum is present. The committee will now vote to report on H.R. 9751. That's the Executive Action Cost Transparency Act, delineating executive actions in the baseline reports. The clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. Norman. Aye. Mr. Norman, aye. Mr. McClintock. Aye. Mr. McClintock, aye. Mr. Grothman. Aye. Mr. Grothman, aye. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Smucker, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein, aye. Mr. Good. Mr. Good, aye. Mr. Bergman. Mr. Bergman, aye. Mr. Ferguson. Mr. Ferguson. Mr. Roy. Mr. Roy, aye. Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore, aye. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, aye. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes, aye. Ms. McLean. Ms. McLean, aye. Ms. Fishbach. Ms. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Yocum. Mr. Yocum, aye. Mr. Burkeen. Mr. Burkeen, aye. Mr. Edwards. Mr. Edwards, aye. Mr. Lopez. Mr. Lopez. Mr. Boyle. Mr. Boyle, no. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, no. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, no. Miss Lee. Miss Lee, no. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Panetta. Mr. Panetta, aye. Miss Wexton. Miss Wexton. Miss Omar. Miss Omar, no. Mr. Trone. Mr. Trone. Miss Ballant. Miss Ballant, no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Espaillat. Mr. Espaillat, no. Mr. Swazi. Mr. Swazi, no. Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, aye.
Any member wish to change their vote? Any member not voted? If the clerk would please give us a report on the tab.
Mr. Chair, on the vote, there were 20 ayes and 12 nays.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion's agreed to. H.R. 9751 is ordered, reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. We'll now move to a vote on H.R. 9714, the Congressional Budget Oversight Act, requiring at least 2 times for the CBO to appear here at the Budget Committee for an oversight hearing. The committee will now go through the roll call.
Mr. Norman. Mr. Norman, aye. Mr. McClintock. Aye. Mr. McClintock, aye. Mr. Grothman. Mr. Grothman, aye. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Smucker, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein, aye. Mr. Good. Mr. Good, aye. Mr. Bergman. Mr. Bergman, aye. Mr. Ferguson. Mr. Ferguson. Mr. Roy. Mr. Roy, aye. Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore, aye. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, aye. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes, aye. Miss McLean. Miss McLean, aye. Miss Fishbach. Miss Fishbach, aye. Mr. Yocum. Mr. Yocum, aye. Mr. Burkeen. Mr. Burkeen, aye. Mr. Edwards. Mr. Edwards, aye. Mr. Lopez.
Aye.
Mr. Lopez, aye. Mr. Boyle.
No.
Mr. Boyle, no. Ms. Schakowsky. No. Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kildee. No. Mr. Kildee, no. Mr. Peters. No. Mr. Peters, no. Miss Lee. No. Miss Lee, no. Mr. Doggett. No. Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Panetta. Aye. Mr. Panetta, aye. Miss Wexton. Miss Wexton. Miss Omar. Miss Omar, no. Mr. Trone. Mr. Trone. Miss Ballant. Miss Ballant, no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Espaillat. Mr. Espaillat, no. Mr. Swazi. Mr. Swazi, no. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Any members haven't voted or wish to change their vote? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on the vote, there were 21 ayes and 12 nays.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion's agreed to. H.R. 9714 is ordered, reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. The committee will now vote to report on H.R. 9711, the Congressional Budget Office Scheduling Reform Act. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Norman. Mr. Norman, aye. Mr. McClintock. Mr. McClintock, aye. Mr. Grothman. Mr. Grothman, aye. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Smucker, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein, aye. Mr. Good. Mr. Good, aye. Mr. Bergman. Mr. Bergman, aye. Mr. Ferguson. Mr. Ferguson. Mr. Roy. Mr. Roy, aye. Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore, aye. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, aye. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes, aye. Ms. McLean. Ms. McLean, aye. Ms. Fishbach. Ms. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Yocum. Mr. Yocum, aye. Mr. Burkeen. Mr. Burkeen, aye. Mr. Edwards. Mr. Edwards, aye. Mr. Lopez. Mr. Lopez, aye. Mr. Boyle. Mr. Boyle, no. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, no. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, no. Miss Lee. Miss Lee, no. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Panetta. Mr. Panetta, aye. Miss Wexton. Miss Wexton. Miss Omar. Miss Omar, no. Mr. Trone. Mr. Trone. Miss Ballant. Miss Ballant, no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Espaillat. Mr. Espaillat, no. Mr. Swazi. Mr. Swazi, no. Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Are there any members that wish to change their vote or members that haven't voted? If not, the clerk shall report.
Mr. Chair, on the vote, there were 21 ayes and 12 nays.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion's agreed to. H.R. 9711 is ordered and reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. And now for our final vote tally on our last bill, the committee will vote to report H.R. 8068 as amended. Stop the Baseline Bloat Act by Mr. Grothman. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Norman. Mr. Norman, aye. Mr. McClintock. Mr. McClintock, aye. Mr. Grothman. Mr. Grothman, aye. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Smucker, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein, aye. Mr. Good. Mr. Good, aye. Mr. Bergman. Mr. Bergman, aye. Mr. Ferguson. Mr. Ferguson. Mr. Roy. Mr. Roy, aye. Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore, aye. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, aye. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes, aye. Miss McLean. Miss McLean, aye. Miss Fishbach. Miss Fishbach, aye. Mr. Yocum. Mr. Yocum, aye. Mr. Burkeen. Mr. Burkeen, aye. Mr. Edwards. Mr. Edwards, aye. Mr. Lopez. Mr. Lopez, aye. Mr. Boyle. Mr. Boyle, no. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, no. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, no. Miss Lee. Miss Lee, no. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Panetta. Mr. Panetta, no. Miss Wexton. Miss Wexton. Miss Omar. Miss Omar, no. Mr. Trone. Mr. Trone. Miss Ballant. Miss Ballant, no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Espaillat. Mr. Espaillat, no. Mr. Swazi? Mr. Swazi, no. Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Anybody wish to change their vote? Anybody not voted?
Mr. Chair, Mr. Carter is not recorded.
How does, okay.
Mr. Carter, aye.
If the clerk will report out once you tally the votes. I have a good feeling about what the opinion of the chair will be, but
Mr. Chair, on the vote, there were 20 ayes and 13 nays.
well, it's in my opinion that the ayes have it. The motion's agreed to, H.R. 8068 as amended, is ordered, reported to the House with favorable recommendations. I said that with the last, this is the final bill. Committee will now vote to report H.R. 9686, and that is the Health Panel Act by Mr. Carter and Burgess. If the clerk would call the roll, please.
Mr. Norman? Mr. Norman, aye. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock, aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman, aye. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Carter? Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein, aye. Mr. Good? Mr. Good, aye. Mr. Bergman? Mr. Bergman, aye. Mr. Ferguson? Mr. Ferguson? Mr. Roy? Mr. Roy, aye. Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore, aye. Mr. Valadeo? Mr. Valadeo, aye. Mr. Estes? Mr. Estes, aye. Ms. McLean? Ms. McLean, aye. Ms. Fishbach? Ms. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Yocum? Mr. Yocum, aye. Mr. Burkeen? Mr. Burkeen, aye. Mr. Edwards? Mr. Edwards, aye. Mr. Lopez? Mr. Lopez, aye. Mr. Boyle? Mr. Boyle, no. Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kildee? Mr. Kildee, no. Mr. Peters? Mr. Peters, no. Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee, no. Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Panetta? Mr. Panetta, no. Ms. Wexton? Ms. Wexton? Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar, no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone? Ms. Ballant? Ms. Ballant, no. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Espaillat? Mr. Espaillat, no. Mr. Swazi? Mr. Swazi, no. Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Anybody not voted or wish to change their vote? The clerk would report out the vote.
Mr. Chair, on the vote, there were 20 ayes and 13 nays.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. H.R. 9686 is ordered reported to the House with favorable recommendation. Without objection, staff's authorized to make any necessary technical and conforming changes to the bills so ordered. Jimmy, you're going to want to hear this. Jimmy, you're going to want to hear this. Jimmy, you're going to want to hear this. Look, there are plenty of, I'm going to close, and I'm going to ask that the ranking member have a comment or two, but let me say this. We got to stretch, we got to push, we got to lean into working together where we can on some of this straightforward stuff. There's plenty of reasons on substance and philosophically, ideologically to be at odds. But if we spend our time saying the Republicans do this, the Democrats do this, let me just say for the Republican side, we've got a lot of work to do. We have failed to put our budget on the committee that we've passed out of this committee twice, and I'm not happy with it. We didn't complete our work on appropriations. I'm not happy with it. I could go down a long list, but let's be clear. Both sides have failed. My Democrat colleagues for 6 years before we got the majority never even passed a budget out here, except a shell budget to do reconciliation. Those are the facts. The sooner we accept that, and we can just come in here, again, not that we won't disagree, the sooner we can just say, we've all failed institutionally, and both parties have fallen short of the 74 Act and just general good stewardship and good governance. The sooner we can dispense with that and debate the merits of these reforms to the process, so that we can do right by the American people, right this ship before it sinks on both sides. That's the vision, quite frankly, for me. As long as I'm chair, that's the vision. And we have to stick our necks out just a little further so that we can lock arms and get this thing back on track for the sake of this great country that we all love and our children that will inherit the whirlwind of our dysfunction and our recklessness and how we resource the government. And with that, Ranking Member.
Well, first, just a little housekeeping. Mr. Chairman, I request the requisite number of days to submit minority views.
Without objection, so ordered. And just for the record, you know I love you and respect you, but when we say we didn't have oversight hearings for 6 years before we got the majority, and you cited a couple dates, those were economic outlook presentations from the CBO. This is not Lake Wobegon for any of us. We should expect that whoever's in charge, that the CBO reports on the work that they do so that they're accountable, so that they can report on how to better do their job so that we can better do ours. And I'm just saying, those weren't oversight.
Well,
hearings. Yes, go
Mr.
ahead.
Chairman,
No,
I
please.
know we're wrapping up. By the
Yeah, we
way, I would point out the chairman, a proud Republican from West Texas, just made an NPR reference. So I worry about your approval ratings back home. But
Purely coincidental.
On the CBO point, I will say that Mr. Swagel has been completely cooperative every single time that we have gone to him with a request. Certainly every time the committee has invited him to testify, he's testified.
Yes.
And I anticipate that won't change. Speaking more generally, however, as we both opened, and I'll close with this, I appreciate very much our close relationship and genuine friendship, and we will continue to work together and find ways where we can, on principle and in good conscience, where we can find ways to agree and to improve this process, which too often has produced a budget that is many, many days late. And you certainly have my word that we'll continue to work together in good faith.
I know that's in good faith and for all my Democrat colleagues as well. So have a great rest of your week. I'd like to thank the members again for their cooperation. That completes today's business. The committee stands adjourned.